He was one of the Luftwaffe's most feared fighter aces, a man who faced hundreds of dogfights and walked away victorious. But on a warm August day in 1943, during a fierce engagement over the Eastern Front, his luck ran out. His aircraft vanished over Soviet territory, and it was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. No wreckage, no remains. Just a name that would echo through history: Max Stotz. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How someone can be so present in one moment, flying through the air at hundreds of miles per hour, locked in combat, making split-second decisions that mean life or death, and then, in the next breath, just gone. Disappeared into the vastness of war. For his family, his comrades, and for history itself, Max Stotz became a question that was never answered, a story without an ending. But to understand how such a man could simply disappear, we must go back to where his story began. Picture, if you will, a small farming community in Mansworth, part of what was then Austria-Hungary. It's 1912, and the world is still a few years away from the Great War that would reshape everything. In this quiet corner of Europe, a boy is born to a farming family, a family that worked the land, knew the rhythms of the seasons, and had no idea that their son would one day soar above the clouds as one of the most skilled fighter pilots of his generation. Max Stotz grew up with dirt under his fingernails and the wide Austrian sky above his head. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He was the son of a farmer, and in those days, that meant hard work, discipline, and a deep connection to the land. But young Max, like so many boys of his time, looked up. He watched the birds wheel and dive, and perhaps he dreamed of what it might be like to join them. By 1933, the world had changed dramatically. The Great War had come and gone. Empires had collapsed, and new nations had risen from the ashes. Austria was no longer part of a grand empire. It was a small republic trying to find its footing in a turbulent Europe. Max Stotz, now a young man of 21, made a decision that would set the course of his life. He joined the Austrian army. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't unusual. For young men in those days, especially those from modest backgrounds, the military offered opportunity. It offered structure, purpose, a paycheck, and, for the ambitious and the brave, a chance to prove yourself. Max proved himself quickly. Within 2 years, by 1935, he had transitioned to the Austrian Air Force. Can you imagine that leap from the fields and barracks to the cockpit of an aircraft? It takes a special kind of courage, a special kind of skill. Flying in the 1930s wasn't like today. Those early military aircraft were temperamental machines, canvas and metal, propellers and pistons. They demanded respect, they demanded mastery. And Max Stotz had it. His flying skills quickly stood out among his peers. Instructors noticed, commanders took note. Here was a young man who didn't just fly. He understood the air, the machine, the dance between the two. But history, as it often does, had other plans. Young men like Stotz didn't just step into history, they were swept into it by the tides of war. In March of 1938, the world watched as German troops marched into Austria. The Anschluss, they called it, the annexation. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation and became part of Nazi Germany. For Max Stotz, this meant his career, his life, everything he'd trained for was now under a new flag. The Austrian Air Force was absorbed into the Luftwaffe, Germany's rapidly expanding air force. Whether he welcomed this change or simply accepted it as the reality of the time, we can't know for certain. What we do know is that Max Stotz became a Luftwaffe pilot, and as Europe edged closer and closer to the abyss of another world war, he would be thrust into the cockpit of history. The Luftwaffe was not just any air force. By the late 1930s, it had become one of the most advanced and feared military aviation forces in the world. New aircraft designs, aggressive tactics, and a generation of young pilots eager to prove themselves. This was the environment Max Stotz entered. He was transferred into Luftwaffe units, initially serving with Jagdgeschwader 76 and then Jagdgeschwader 54. These weren't just squadrons, they were brotherhoods. Men who flew together, fought together, and too often died together. And then came September 1, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Max Stotz's first taste of combat came during those opening weeks of the war. The invasion of Poland was swift and brutal, and the Luftwaffe played a critical role. German fighters swept Polish aircraft from the skies, and bombers pounded cities and military targets. For a young pilot like Stotz, these were his first real missions, not training exercises, but life and death. Adrenaline, fear, the roar of the engine. The rattle of machine guns, the sight of an enemy aircraft in your sights or, worse, on your tail. He survived. More than that, he began to accumulate victories, confirmed kills of enemy aircraft. These weren't just numbers on a scoreboard. Each one represented a moment of skill, of nerve, of surviving when the odds were stacked against you. After Poland fell, the war entered what some called the Phony War, a strange period where the Western Front was relatively quiet. But quiet didn't mean peaceful. Patrols still flew, skirmishes still happened, and Max Stotz continued to fly, continued to hone his skills, continued to add to his tally of aerial victories. He was becoming something more than just a pilot. He was becoming an ace. But the skies over Western Europe were only the beginning. The real storm was still to come. In the spring of 1940, that storm broke. Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the Blitzkrieg they called it, Lightning War. And the Luftwaffe was at the tip of the spear. Max Stotz was there, flying mission after mission during the Battle of France. The skies were crowded with aircraft, German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, British Hurricanes and Spitfires, French Marines and Dewoitines. It was chaos. It was deadly. And it was where Max Stotz truly demonstrated his exceptional skill. He shot down British aircraft. He shot down French aircraft. Each victory was a testament to his growing mastery of aerial combat. But it wasn't just about the kills. It was about situational awareness, knowing where every aircraft was in a swirling dogfight. It was about patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was about aggression tempered with caution, pressing the attack but knowing when to disengage and live to fight another day. His comrades began to notice something about Max. He wasn't loud or boastful. He didn't brag about his victories or seek glory. He was quiet, methodical, focused. They started calling him a silent hunter. While other aces might return from a mission full of stories and bravado, Max simply did his job, flew his missions, and let his record speak for itself. There's a dignity in that, don't you think? A kind of professionalism that transcends the horror of war. For his bravery and his performance during these campaigns, Max Stotz was awarded the Iron Cross. It was a recognition of his skill, his courage, and his contribution to his squadron's success. But medals, as any veteran knows, are cold comfort. They can't bring back friends who didn't make it home. They can't erase the images burned into your memory. And yet, the war continued. France fell. Britain stood alone, and the Luftwaffe turned its attention to the skies over England. But Max Stotz's story was about to take a different turn. Because every ace meets the front where legends are forged and broken. For Stotz, that front was the East. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Germany launched the largest invasion in the history of warfare, sending millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft crashing into the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was born, and it would become a meat grinder unlike anything the world had ever seen. Max Stotz moved to the Soviet front as part of the Luftwaffe's massive air operations supporting Army Group North. If you thought the skies over France were chaotic, the Eastern Front was something else entirely. The distances were vast. Endless forests, sprawling plains, rivers that stretched for miles. The weather was brutal, scorching summers, freezing winters, mud that could swallow entire armies. And the Soviets, despite heavy losses in the early weeks, kept coming. More planes, more pilots, more targets. Max Stotz flew in these brutal conditions, and he adapted. The Eastern Front demanded a different style of warfare, relentless, chaotic, unforgiving. Soviet tactics were different from the British and French. Soviet aircraft were different, and the sheer scale of the combat was overwhelming. But Max thrived. He shot down his first Soviet bomber over the town of Ostrov, then another, and another. The victories started to add up quickly. In the east, there were always targets: Soviet bombers attacking German positions, Soviet fighters trying to protect them, dogfights that erupted without warning. For a skilled pilot, the opportunities for aerial combat were almost endless, but so were the dangers. Anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, getting lost over hostile territory, engine trouble in sub-zero temperatures, and of course, Soviet pilots who were learning, adapting, getting better with every passing month. But in the East, no one was untouchable, not even the most skilled. Still, through 1941 and into 1942, Max Stotz's reputation continued to grow. His kill count climbed steadily. Yak-1 fighters, Lay GG-3s, Ilyushin bombers. Each victory was recorded, verified by witnesses or gun camera footage. The numbers were climbing towards something extraordinary. And then, in the autumn of 1942, Max Stotz reached a milestone that only a handful of pilots in history have ever achieved. On October 29, 1942, Max Stotz shot down his 100th enemy aircraft. Let that sink in for a moment. 100 aerial victories. Think about what that means. 100 times Max Stotz climbed into his aircraft, flew into hostile skies, engaged an enemy pilot, and emerged victorious. 100 times he relied on his skill, his instincts, and no small amount of luck to survive. 100 times another pilot didn't make it home. For this incredible achievement, Max Stotz was awarded one of Germany's highest military honors, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, and not just awarded by some distant bureaucrat. He was personally decorated by Adolf Hitler himself. Now, we look back on that moment through the lens of history, knowing what we know now about the regime he served. But in that moment, for Max Stotz, it was recognition of his extraordinary skill and bravery. He had become one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, his name spoken with respect and admiration among his fellow pilots. But while the medals shined bright, the Eastern Front was darkening. By 1943, the war that Germany thought it would win quickly had become something else entirely. The Blitzkrieg had stalled. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. And more than that, the Soviets were getting stronger. Their factories, relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, were producing aircraft by the thousands. New designs were appearing, better fighters, faster, more maneuverable. And Soviet pilots, those who had survived the brutal learning curve of 1941 and 1942, were no longer easy prey. They had learned from their mistakes. They had developed tactics. They had become dangerous. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was being stretched thinner and thinner. Pilots were exhausted. flying mission after mission with little rest. Aircraft were wearing out faster than they could be replaced, and the losses were mounting. For every ace like Max Stotz who racked up impressive numbers, there were dozens of young pilots who didn't survive their first few missions. The Eastern Front was devouring men and machines at a terrifying rate, but Max Stotz continued to lead. By 1943, he wasn't just an ace, he was a Staffelkapitän, a squadron leader, commanding the 5th Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 54. This meant he wasn't just responsible for his own survival anymore. He had young pilots looking to him for leadership, for guidance, for an example of how to survive in those deadly skies. And Max, true to his nature, led from the front. He didn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Even with the increasing danger, even as the Soviet Air Force grew more formidable, Max Stotz remained one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. His victories continued to accumulate. But he also knew, and I think every combat pilot knows this in their bones, that each flight could be his last. There's a saying among fighter pilots, "You're only as good as your last mission." And in the summer of 1943, the missions were getting deadlier. How do you think that feels? To wake up every morning knowing that the odds are slowly turning against you? To strap yourself into a cockpit knowing that the enemy is stronger today than they were yesterday? Some men cracked under that pressure. Some requested transfers. Some simply lost their edge. But Max kept flying. Was it duty, pride, loyalty to his squadron? Or perhaps, like so many warriors throughout history, he simply didn't know how to do anything else. War has a way of becoming your entire world, doesn't it? And then came that August day, the mission that would erase him from history's map. August 19th, 1943. The date is seared into the records, but the details, the full truth of what happened, remain frustratingly incomplete. What we know is this. Max Stotz and his squadron were scrambled to intercept a large formation of Soviet aircraft. Intelligence had reported enemy fighters in their sector, Yak-9s, one of the Soviet Union's newer and more capable fighters. The Yak-9 was a worthy opponent, fast and agile, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, it could take on anything the Luftwaffe had. Max Stotz climbed into his Focke-Wulf Fw 190A6. The Fu-190 was a beautiful machine, powerful, rugged, deadly. German pilots loved it. It had a radial engine that could take punishment and keep running, and it was armed with machine guns and cannons that could tear an enemy aircraft apart. Max had flown many aircraft during his career, but the Fw-190 had become his mount of choice on the Eastern Front. The engines roared to life. The squadron took off, climbing into the summer sky. Somewhere ahead, Soviet fighters were waiting. Radio chatter crackled. Eyes scanned the horizon, and then contact. Aircraft spotted. The two formations saw each other, turned, and accelerated toward combat. What happened next unfolded in minutes, maybe seconds. A dogfight is a blur of motion, of gut-wrenching turns, of split-second decisions. Aircraft wheel and dive, trying to get on each other's tails. Tracers arc through the sky, the rattle of gunfire, the smell of cordite and aviation fuel. Your heart pounding so hard you can hear it over the engine. Witnesses from Max's squadron reported that his Fw-190 was seen taking hits. Perhaps he was caught in a crossfire. Perhaps a Soviet pilot got a lucky burst. Perhaps his attention was focused on one target, and he didn't see another diving on him from above. We'll never know exactly what happened in those critical seconds, but his aircraft was hit, damaged, and Max Stotz made the decision that every pilot dreads. He had to bail out. Imagine that moment. Your aircraft is dying around you. Smoke filling the cockpit. Controls not responding. the ground spinning below, and you have to release your straps, fight against the wind and G-forces, and throw yourself out into thin air, trusting that a silk parachute will save your life. Max's parachute opened. Several members of his squadron saw it. A white canopy against the blue sky, proof that he'd made it out alive. There must have been a moment of relief among his comrades. He's alive, he got out. But their relief was short-lived because as they watched, they realized where he was drifting. The winds were carrying him east, down toward the ground, into Soviet-held territory. And that changed everything. It was the last time anyone saw Max Stotz alive. His squadron couldn't land to rescue him. Soviet fighters were still in the area. Ground forces were hostile. All they could do was watch as their commander, their friend, descended into enemy territory and disappeared from view. They flew back to base, reported what they'd seen, and hoped that somehow Max would make it back, that he'd evade capture, link up with German forces, and walk through the door with one of those incredible escape stories that fighter pilots sometimes came home with. But he never did. Max Stotz was officially declared missing in action near Kirov, in what was then the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, today's Belarus. Search parties couldn't be sent into Soviet-held territory. Communications couldn't be established with Soviet authorities. They were, after all, in the middle of a brutal war. So, Max Stotz simply became another name on a very long list. Missing in action. His aircraft was never recovered. No wreckage was ever confirmed. No crash site was ever officially identified. And most haunting of all, no remains were ever found. It was as if Max Stotz had simply vanished into the vast expanse of the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe, recognizing his service and achievements, promoted him posthumously to Hauptmann, captain. It was an honor, certainly, but a cold comfort. His family received notification that he was missing, presumed dead. His name was recorded in the books of aerial aces. His victories were tallied. His decorations were noted. But Max himself, the man, not the legend, was gone. And that should have been the end of the story. But legends don't fade quietly. They leave questions and quests. The decades rolled by. The war ended. Germany was divided, then reunited. The Soviet Union rose to superpower status, then collapsed. New nations emerged. Borders changed. And through it all, the mystery of Max Stotz remained. What happened to him after he landed? Was he captured? Did he die from his injuries? Was he killed by Soviet soldiers or partisans? Was he taken prisoner and died in a camp? The questions had no answers. Historians began to take interest. Aviation enthusiasts, those dedicated souls who painstakingly research every aircraft loss, every pilot's fate, started digging through records. They interviewed survivors, searched archives, cross-referenced German and Soviet documents. Some even traveled to Belarus, to the forests and fields near where Max was last seen, searching for any clue. Local reports surfaced over the years. An old farmer remembered hearing stories about a German pilot who came down near his village. Another person recalled rumors of a crashed aircraft somewhere in the woods. But none of it was conclusive. The forests of Belarus are vast and dense, and in the 70-plus years since that August day, nature has reclaimed countless crash sites. Metal corrodes, wood rots. Earth and vegetation swallow what war left behind. Metal detector enthusiasts and organized search teams have combed areas where Max might have come down. Some have found aircraft debris, pieces of Luftwaffe planes, Soviet planes, scattered across the landscape like tragic puzzle pieces, but nothing definitively linked to Max Stotz, nothing that could bring closure. His name remains on lists of missing aces, pilots whose final fates were never determined. And with each passing decade, the line between history and mystery only grew thinner. The witnesses have aged and passed away. The landscape has changed, and the truth, if it still exists somewhere in those forests, becomes harder and harder to find. But here's what I find remarkable. People still search. They still care. Why? Because Max Stotz wasn't just a number, wasn't just a name on a list. He was a human being. Beyond the ace, beyond the 100 victories, beyond the medals and the military records, there was a man. A young man who grew up on a farm in Austria, who joined the army and learned to fly, who fell in love with aviation before that love became tangled up with war, who had hopes and dreams that we'll never know about, who felt fear every time he climbed into that cockpit but climbed in anyway, who led his men with quiet competence, who, in his final moments, must have felt the terror of his aircraft being hit, the desperate hope that his parachute would open, and then what? Relief? Fear? Resignation? Max Stotz's legacy is not just about victories. It's about the final unknown. It's about all the questions we can never ask him. What did he think about the war? Did he believe in the cause he fought for? Or was he just doing his duty? Did he struggle with the men he'd killed? Did he miss his home? Did he have someone waiting for him, hoping he'd return? We'll never know. And that's part of what makes his story so haunting. But his story is also bigger than just one man. Max Stotz represents thousands, no, hundreds of thousands, of airmen who vanished without a trace during that terrible war. Not just Germans, but Soviets, British, Americans, Japanese, Italians, men from every nation that sent aircraft into combat. For every pilot whose body was recovered, whose grave was marked, whose family got closure, there were others who simply disappeared. The Eastern Front became their final grave, unmarked and unseen. The vastness of that front, the chaos of the combat, the sheer scale of the destruction, it swallowed men whole and kept their secrets. Today, all these years later, remains are still being found. Aircraft are still being excavated. Families are still, occasionally, getting answers about loved ones who went missing 8 decades ago. But the silence around Max Stotz's disappearance isn't an end. It's an echo that reminds us of the cost of war. Not just the cost measured in lives lost, though that cost is staggering, but the cost measured in unanswered questions, in grief that never finds resolution, in families who spent generations wondering what happened to their father, their brother, their son. Max Stotz's story is still told in aviation history circles. Books about Luftwaffe aces include his name and recount his achievements. Online forums dedicated to World War II aviation discuss his case, share theories, post maps of possible crash sites. His name stands among the top Luftwaffe aces of the Second World War. He's right there with the most famous names, the pilots whose stories have been told and retold. But unlike many of them, Max Stotz's story ends not with certainty, but with a question mark. And I think that's fitting in a way, isn't it? Because war itself is full of question marks, full of moments that are never resolved, decisions that are never explained, fates that are never determined. We like our history to be neat, to have beginnings and endings, to answer all the questions. But life, especially life in war, isn't neat. It's messy and tragic and often senseless. Max Stotz vanished on August 19, 1943. His aircraft went down somewhere in Belarus. His parachute opened, and then nothing. Just silence. Just the wind in the trees and the passage of time and the slow, patient work of nature reclaiming what man destroyed. It's a haunting reminder of the countless souls lost in the vast expanse of war. Not just the soldiers whose names are on memorials, but those whose names exist only in fading records and family memories. Those who have no grave that can be visited, no stone that marks where they fell, no final resting place that offers closure. and yet their stories matter. Max Stotz's story matters, because every time we tell it, every time we remember, we're saying something important. You existed. You mattered. Your life, your skill, your courage, they weren't erased just because your final fate is unknown. History hasn't forgotten you. The skies over the Eastern Front still hold their secrets. Max Stotz was one of the most accomplished fighter pilots of his time. Yet, even legends can vanish without a trace. His story isn't just about war. It's about the human cost of conflict and the mysteries it leaves behind. It's about the young man from a farming family who learned to master the sky, who became one of the most skilled pilots of his generation, and who, on one August day, flew into history and never returned. Somewhere in Belarus, in a forest or a field, beneath the earth and the vegetation of 80 years, there may still be evidence of what happened. Pieces of an FW-190, perhaps even remains that could be identified with modern DNA technology. Maybe someday someone will find them. Maybe someday Max Stotz will finally come home. Or maybe the forest will keep its secret forever. Either way, his story lives on. In the books, in the forums, in videos like this one, and in the hearts of those who understand that behind every military statistic, every victory tally, every name on a memorial wall, there was a real person. A person who lived, who loved, who feared, who hoped, and who in the end gave everything. If stories like this matter to you, stories of courage, sacrifice, and unanswered questions, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us, should history keep searching for pilots like Max Stotz? Should we keep digging through archives and forests, hoping to bring these men home? Or is there something to be said for letting the past rest? Your voice keeps these stories alive. Your engagement tells us that these forgotten heroes, these missing warriors, still matter after all these years. Because as long as we remember, as long as we tell their stories, they haven't truly vanished. They're still with us, still teaching us, still reminding us of what war costs and why peace matters. Max Stotz flew into the unknown on August 19, 1943. But his memory, his legacy, and his story, those are still here. And that's something worth preserving. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for honoring the courage of men like Max Stotz, who flew into danger time and time again, until one day they didn't come back.